The sun had just begun to rise over the city as Nina wiped down the counters at Joe's cafe for what felt like the 1,000th time. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and faint shadows under her eyes revealed the toll of working. Double shifts while attending nursing classes. Today marked her 3rd year at the cafe, a milestone that meant little to anyone but her. "Another coffee, please," called a regular from the corner booth, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. Nina nodded and prepared the order, her movements efficient from years of practice. The morning rush would begin soon. Business people, grabbing their caffeine fix before heading to their downtown offices. Students loading up on sugar and energy drinks before classes. She knew most of their orders by heart. "You dropped this yesterday," her coworker Luis said, handing her an envelope. "Your grades, right? You were in such a hurry after your shift." Nina took the envelope with a grateful smile. Inside were her midterm results, all A's, despite her grueling schedule. Sometimes she wondered if all this struggle would pay off, if there would ever be a day when she wasn't counting pennies or worrying about rent. Growing up in the foster system had taught Nina to depend only on herself. Her last foster home had been decent enough, the family kind, but overwhelmed with too many children and too little money. When she aged out at 18, she'd been on her own completely, working and saving for community college one semester at a time. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and an elderly man walked in, moving slowly with the help of a polished wooden cane. He wore an expensive-looking gray coat despite the warming spring weather. Nina had noticed him coming in daily for the past week. Always alone, always choosing the same window seat where he would stare out at the street while drinking a single black coffee. "Good morning," Nina said, as he approached the counter. "The usual?" He nodded without really looking at her, placing exact change on the counter before she even rang up the order. There was something elegant about him, from his perfectly trimmed white beard to his straight posture, despite his apparent age. The other staff had been gossiping about him, wondering why someone who clearly had money would spend his mornings in their modest cafe. Nina prepared his coffee and brought it to his table by the window. Unlike other customers who barely acknowledged her existence, he lifted his eyes to thank her. They were dark and intelligent, with a hint of sadness that made Nina wonder about his story. An hour passed with the usual morning chaos. Nina moved between tables, took orders, and cleared dishes in a familiar dance of customer service. When she noticed the elderly man getting up to leave, she hurried over to clear his table. That's when she saw it, a flash of red against the white napkin he'd left behind. Thinking he might have dropped something important, Nina called out, but he had already disappeared through the door. She lifted the napkin to find a stunning ruby ring with intricate gold designs surrounding the stone. Nina held it up to the light, mesmerized by how the sunlight caught the deep red gem. It was clearly valuable. More valuable than anything she'd ever owned. For a fleeting moment, she thought about what selling it could mean, paying off her student loans, maybe even a full semester without working herself to exhaustion. But that thought vanished as quickly as it had come. Someone had lost something precious, and Nina knew all too well what it felt like to lose things that mattered. "Hey, Luis," she called to her coworker. "Did you see which way that older gentleman went?" Luis shrugged. "He usually turns right toward the park. Who knows where he goes after that?" "Why?" "He left something behind," Nina replied, carefully wrapping the ring in a clean napkin and tucking it into her apron pocket. "I'll put it in the lost and found. Maybe he'll come back tomorrow." But the next day came and went with no sign of the elderly man. Nina kept the ring locked in her small locker at work, checking periodically to make sure it was still there. By the 3rd day, she began to worry he might not return. During her lunch break, she showed the ring to Penny, the cafe owner's wife who sometimes helped during busy hours. "This is no ordinary ring," Penny said, examining it closely through her reading glasses. "These markings look like a family crest of some kind, and this ruby is real, honey, very real." "I need to find the owner," Nina insisted. "Do any of the regulars know that older man who sits by the window?" After asking around, a business customer mentioned that the description sounded like Edward Chen, the founder of Chen Industries. Nina's eyes widened at the name. Chen Industries was one of the largest tech manufacturing companies in the country. Their downtown headquarters stood just 5 blocks from the cafe. When her shift ended at 3, Nina changed from her coffee-stained uniform into her only decent outfit. Black pants and a simple blue blouse she wore for class presentations. The ring was secure in her pocket as she walked the 5 blocks to the gleaming Chen Industries tower. The lobby was intimidating, all marble floors and security guards with stern expressions. Nina approached the reception desk hesitantly. "Excuse me," she began. "I need to return something to Mr. Chen. Something important he left at Joe's cafe." The receptionist, a polished woman with perfectly styled hair, gave Nina a dismissive look. "Mr. Chen doesn't take unscheduled visitors. You can leave whatever it is, and I'll make sure it reaches him." Nina shook her head, clutching the ring tighter in her pocket. "I'm sorry, but I'd prefer to give it to him personally. It's very valuable." Without an appointment, the receptionist began, but was interrupted by the arrival of several men in suits exiting the elevator. Nina's heart jumped when she recognized the elderly man from the cafe among them. He moved, more confidently here, less stooped, nodding as a younger executive spoke animatedly beside him. "Mr. Chen," Nina called out before she could lose her nerve. "Excuse me, Mr. Chen." The security guard moved toward her, but the elderly man turned at the sound of her voice. For a moment he looked confused, but then recognition dawned on his face. "You're from the cafe," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. Nina nodded, suddenly feeling very out of place in the grand lobby. "You left something behind the other day. I've been hoping you'd come back so I could return it." She carefully withdrew the napkin from her pocket and unfolded it to reveal the ruby ring. The effect on Mr. Chen was immediate and striking. His composed expression crumbled and he reached out with slightly trembling hands. "You found it," he whispered, taking the ring gently. "You found it and brought it back." The younger executives exchanged confused glances as their boss stared at the small woman in simple clothes who had returned something that clearly meant far more than its monetary value. "Thank you," Mr. Chen said, regaining his composure. "Many would not have been so honest. This ring belonged to my sister. It's the last thing I have of her." Nina smiled, glad to have returned something so meaningful. "I understand how important keepsakes can be. I'm just happy I caught you." She turned to leave, considering her good deed done, but Mr. Chen called after her. "Wait, please. What's your name?" "Nina," she replied. "Nina Wei." Something flickered across his face, a strange look of surprise, perhaps even shock. He studied her features more carefully now, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "Wei?" he repeated. "Would you mind telling me, Nina Wei? What do you know about your family?" Nina stood frozen in the gleaming lobby of Chen Industries, caught off guard by the unexpected question. The security guards watched her with suspicious eyes, but Mr. Chen waved them back. "My family," she repeated, confused by his sudden interest. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in foster care. I don't know my birth parents." Mr. Chen's expression changed in a way Nina couldn't quite read. He glanced at the executives hovering nearby and made a quick decision. "Come up to my office," he said, his voice gentler than before. "Please, I'd like to talk with you properly." Nina hesitated, looking down at her watch. "I have a night class in 2 hours." "I'll make sure you get there on time," Mr. Chen promised. "This is important." Curiosity won over caution. Nina followed Mr. Chen to a private elevator that whisked them to the top floor. The executives who had been with him stayed behind, exchanging puzzled glances. Mr. Chen's office was spacious but surprisingly modest for someone of his wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city. On his desk sat framed photographs, the only personal touch in the otherwise businesslike space. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from his desk. He remained standing, turning the ruby ring over in his fingers. "How long have you worked at that cafe?" 3 years, Nina replied. "It helps pay for nursing. School." Mr. Chen nodded appreciatively. Hard work and dedication, admirable qualities. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. What do you know about how you entered the foster system? Nina shifted uncomfortably. These were personal questions from someone she barely knew. Yet something in the old man's manner, a mix of hope and fear, made her answer. Not much. I was found when I was about 3 years old. No identification except for a small jade pendant with Chinese characters and my first name pinned to my coat. The authorities couldn't locate any family. Mr. Chen's breath caught. He moved to one of the framed photos on his desk and handed it to Nina. It showed a young couple standing in front of a garden gate. The woman was beautiful, with a warm smile that reached her eyes. The man beside her looked proud, his arm protectively around her shoulders. This is my sister, Lynn, and her husband, Mr. Chen explained. 20 years ago, they left on a journey overseas during political unrest in the region they were visiting. They never returned. They had a daughter, my niece, who disappeared with them. Nina stared at the photograph, her heart beginning to race. The woman in the picture had the same high cheekbones Nina saw in her own reflection every morning. Mr. Chen, she said carefully, what are you suggesting? Instead of answering directly, he pointed to another photograph, a little girl, maybe 2 years old, wearing a red dress and holding a stuffed panda. Around her neck was a jade pendant. Nina's hand instinctively went to her throat where her own pendant would have been if she hadn't pawned it last year to pay for textbooks. That pendant looks like the one you were found with, Mr. Chen finished. And the child's name was Nina. The office seemed to spin around her. Nina gripped the arms of her chair, trying to make sense of what he was suggesting. This could be a coincidence, she said, practicality asserting itself. Nina isn't an uncommon name, and jade pendants are. The ruby ring you returned belonged to my sister, Mr. Chen interrupted gently. It's a family heirloom with our family crest engraved inside the band. Lynn always wore it for good luck. She would have kept it with her, protected it, even in danger. He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every bit his age. For 20 years I've searched. Hired investigators, contacted authorities, followed every possible lead. I never stopped believing my niece might be alive somewhere. Nina felt a strange buzzing in her ears. This was too much, too sudden, like something from a movie, not real life. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying, Mr. Chen replied, his voice barely above a whisper, that there's a possibility, just a possibility, that you might be my sister's daughter, my long-lost niece. Nina shook her head in disbelief. That's impossible. Is it? He leaned forward. The timing matches. Your age matches. You have no known family history. The pendant you described matches, the one in the photo. But I'm nobody, Nina blurted out. I work in a cafe. I live in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates. I can barely afford community college. Mr. Chen's eyes softened. None of that matters. What matters is finding the truth. He hesitated before continuing. Would you consider a DNA test? It would. Tell us for certain. Nina's mind raced through the implications. If this was true, and it seemed far too fantastic to be true, her entire life would change. The lonely holidays, the struggle for every dollar, the constant uncertainty of her future. Could all that really be replaced by family, by belonging? Need time to think, she said finally. This is a lot to take in. Mr. Chen nodded, reaching for a business card and writing a personal number on the back. Take all the time you need. When you're ready, if you're ready, call me. As Nina stood to leave, he added, whatever you decide, whatever the test might show, your honesty in returning the ring speaks volumes about your character. Lynn would be proud of the woman you've become. Those words followed Nina out of the building, through her evening class where she couldn't focus on a single word her professor said, and back to her cramped apartment. Her roommates were out, giving her blessed silence to process the day's events. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching city lights flicker in the darkness. All her life she'd wondered about her origins, made up stories as a child about parents who would someday return for her. Eventually she'd packed those fantasies away, accepting that some questions would never be answered. Now answers might be within reach. But did she want them? What if the test was negative and this glimpse of belonging was snatched away? Or what if it was positive? Could she adjust to such a dramatic change in circumstances? On her small desk sat her nursing textbooks and carefully organized study notes. She'd created this path for herself through sheer determination. Would finding a family, a wealthy one at that, somehow diminish what she'd accomplished on her own? Nina's phone buzzed with a text from Luis asking if she'd be working tomorrow. Normal life continued regardless of existential questions. She replied yes, then noticed the time, past midnight. She had an early shift, then a lab practical at noon. As she prepared for bed, Nina caught her reflection in the mirror. For the first time, she tried to see herself through new eyes. Was that her mother's smile? Her father's determined chin? Had she inherited Mr. Chen's observant gaze? That night, Nina dreamed of the jade pendant she no longer owned. In the dream, the Chinese characters engraved on it rearranged themselves into a map, leading her through unfamiliar streets to a garden gate, the same one from the photograph. She woke before dawn, her decision made. Whether the test results connected her to the Chens or not, she deserved to know her story. Everyone deserved that much. With trembling fingers, Nina reached for her phone and pulled out the business card Mr. Chen had given her. The sky was just beginning to lighten as she dialed his number. Mr. Chen? It's Nina. She took a deep breath. I'd like to take that DNA test. On the other end of the line, she heard a soft intake of breath, then his voice, warm with hope. Thank you, Nina. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. As Nina hung up, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, the possibility that she might not be alone in the world after all. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Nina's life. Each day she went through the motions, serving coffee with a smile, taking notes in class, studying late into the night. But her mind constantly drifted to the DNA test. The sample had been taken at a private lab, Mr. Chen insisting on the highest level of accuracy and confidentiality. Order up, Luis called from the kitchen, sliding a plate of pancakes across the counter. Hey, you okay? You've been spacing out all morning. Nina blinked, forcing herself back to the present. Just tired, she lied, grabbing the plate. It wasn't that she didn't trust Luis. They'd worked together for 3 years. But how could she explain something she barely understood herself? The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Nina's heart jumped when she saw Mr. Chen enter. He wasn't due to meet her until tomorrow when the results were supposed to be ready. Had something changed? He caught her eye and gave a small nod, taking his usual window seat. Nina quickly delivered the pancakes to table 4, then made her way over, coffee pot in hand. You're early today, she said, trying to sound casual as she poured his usual black coffee. I couldn't stay away, he admitted. The lab called. The results came in ahead of schedule. Nina's hand trembled, nearly spilling the coffee. And? I haven't looked, Mr. Chen said. I thought we should find out together. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a sealed envelope. When do you finish your shift? 2 hours, Nina replied, glancing at the clock. I'll wait. And he did, nursing his coffee, occasionally checking his phone or gazing out the window. Nina felt his presence like a weight as she worked, aware of how this moment might be the dividing line between her old life and whatever came next. When her shift finally ended, Nina untied her apron with shaking hands. I know a quiet place in the park across the street, she suggested. We could open it there. They walked together in silence, finding an empty bench beneath a flowering cherry tree. Pink petals occasionally drifted down around them, like nature's gentle snow. Mr. Chen held out the envelope. You should do the honors, he said. Nina took it, studying the lab's official seal. What if? She started, then stopped herself. Whatever it says, nothing changes about who you are, Mr. Chen assured her. You're still the honest young woman who returned a precious ring when many would have kept it. Taking a deep breath, Nina broke the seal and pulled out the paper inside. Her eyes scanned the medical jargon, looking for the conclusion. When she found it, the world seemed to still around her. Probability of relation. 99.8%, she read aloud, her voice barely above. A whisper. The subject is consistent with being the biological niece of the sample provider. Mr. Chen's weathered hand covered his mouth as tears filled his eyes. I found you, he whispered. After all these years, I finally found you. Nina stared at the paper, trying to process what this meant. So my mother, your sister, Lin, Mr. Chen said gently. Her name was Lin Chen-wei. Your father was Tao Wei. Were they? Nina couldn't finish the question. Mr. Chen nodded sadly. We believe so. They were in a region that experienced a violent uprising. Many foreigners were lost. We never found. He cleared his throat. But you survived. Somehow, you survived. Nina looked up at the cherry blossoms, pink against the blue sky. Somewhere in her earliest memories, there was a woman's voice singing softly, the scent of jasmine, strong arms holding her close. Were these real memories, or just wishes she'd created to fill the void? I have so many questions, she said finally. As do I, Mr. Chen replied. A lifetime of them, but we have time now. He hesitated before adding, there are others who want to meet you. Your cousins, your aunt, my wife. Our family has never forgotten you, even without knowing if you were alive. Family. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and complication. This is a lot to take in, Nina admitted. My whole life I thought I was alone in the world, and now suddenly I have this whole other identity, this history I know nothing about. We'll take it slowly, Mr. Chen promised. One day at a time. As they sat in the park, an older couple walked by, hand in hand, smiling at the cherry blossoms. Nina wondered how many springs the Chen family had marked without her, how many birthdays and holidays had passed with her absence like a shadow over their celebrations. What happens now? She asked. That's entirely up to you, Mr. Chen said. Nothing has to change if you don't want it to. Your life is your own. He paused. But if you're willing, I'd like you to come to dinner. Meet the family. Let us start. To know the woman you've become. Nina thought about her tiny apartment, her struggle to pay tuition, the years of wondering where she came from. But she also thought about her independence, her hard-won achievements, the life she'd built from nothing. I can do dinner, she said finally. But I'm not making any big decisions right away. I need time. Relief washed over Mr. Chen's face. Time is something we have plenty of now. As they left the park, Nina noticed Mr. Chen walking taller as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. At the street corner where they would part ways, she to her apartment, he to his office, he paused. There's one more thing, he said, reaching into his pocket. This belongs to you. In his palm lay a jade pendant, identical to the one Nina had pawned a year ago. She gasped. How did you? It wasn't difficult to track down, Mr. Chen explained. Not when I knew exactly what I was looking for. Nina took the pendant, running her finger over the Chinese characters carved into its smooth surface. What do they mean? She asked. I never knew. Protection, Mr. Chen translated, and beloved daughter. His voice caught on the last word. Lin had it made for you when you were born. Nina closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling a connection to her past that had been missing her entire life. Thank you. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, Mr. Chen confirmed. I'll send a car. No need, Nina said firmly. I can find my own way there. Just text me the address. Mr. Chen smiled at her independence. As you wish. After they parted, Nina walked to her afternoon class in a daze. The world looked the same. Same streets, same buildings, same hurried pedestrians, but everything had changed. She had a name now. A history. People who had been looking for her. In her evening study group, Nina couldn't focus. Her lab partner noticed. Earth to Nina, he said, waving a hand in front of her face. You with us? Sorry, she mumbled. Just distracted. Big date tonight? Another classmate teased. Nina smiled faintly. Family dinner, she said, testing how the words felt in her mouth. With relatives I haven't seen in a very long time. That night, Nina stood in front of her small mirror, the jade pendant cool against her skin. Her roommates had already left for their evening plans, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Tomorrow she would step into the Chen family home as the long-lost daughter of Lin and Tao Wei. Would she find echoes of herself there? Would they see shadows of her parents in her face? Her phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Chen. No, her Uncle Edward, she corrected herself. He had sent a photo of an old family album he'd found, opened to a page with baby pictures. Her baby pictures. Nina sank onto her bed, staring at the tiny face smiling up from another life. For the first time since receiving the news, she allowed herself to cry. For the parents she couldn't remember, for the family she never knew she had, and for the lonely little girl who had grown up believing no one had ever wanted her. When the tears finally stopped, Nina felt lighter somehow. Whatever happened next, at least now she knew where she came from. The missing pieces of her story were finally falling into place. The Chen family home wasn't the mansion Nina had imagined, but a spacious house in an upscale neighborhood with a garden that wrapped around the property. As her taxi pulled up to the gate, Nina's stomach twisted with nerves. She smoothed down her dress, the nicest one she owned, though she suspected it cost less than the flower arrangements visible through the windows. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the doorbell. The sound had barely faded when the door swung open, revealing Edward Chen with an expectant smile. You came, he said, relief evident in his voice. I said I would, Nina replied, stepping inside. The house was warm and inviting, with soft lighting, and furniture that looked both expensive and well-used. Photos lined the hallway, generations of Chens smiling from silver frames. Edward led her toward the sound of voices coming from what turned out to be a large living room. Conversation stopped as Nina entered. 4 people turned to look at her, an elegant older woman with silver-streaked hair, a middle-aged couple, and a young man about Nina's age. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to barely contained emotion. Everyone, Edward said, his voice slightly unsteady. This is Nina. The older woman rose first. She moved with grace, her eyes never leaving Nina's face. I'm Mei Chen, Edward's wife, she said, taking Nina's hands in hers. Welcome to our home. In May's eyes, Nina saw not just welcome, but understanding. This woman had mourned alongside Edward, had kept the memory of Lin alive all these years. Thank you for having me, Nina managed to say. The others introduced themselves. Peter, Edward's son, and his wife, Lily. Their son, David, who was studying medicine at the university across town. Nina shook hands, tried to smile, feeling like she was in a dream. You look so much like her, Lily said softly. Like Lin, especially around the eyes. Nina didn't know how to respond. How strange to resemble someone she couldn't remember, to carry the features of a woman who existed only in photographs for her. Dinner was served in a dining room overlooking the garden. The meal was traditional Chinese cuisine, far better than the takeout Nina occasionally splurged on. Between bites, the family filled the silence with careful questions. They seemed to sense her discomfort, steering clear of anything too personal, at first. Edward tells us you're studying nursing, Peter said. That's admirable work. I've always wanted to help people, Nina replied. It was the simplest truth she could offer. Lin was the same way, May said with a sad smile. She volunteered, at clinics whenever she traveled with Tao. She couldn't bear to see suffering without trying to ease it. Nina's throat tightened at this small connection to her mother. What was my father like? She asked. David, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Uncle Tao was the best. He taught me to fly kites when I was little before they left on their last trip. He always said the trick was to know when to hold tight and when to give slack. He glanced at his grandfather. We still have videos of them if you want to see. Nina nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After dinner, they gathered in the living room. Edward set up an old video player, his hands careful with the tapes. These are precious to us, he explained. Memories we thought we might be preserving, only for ourselves. The first video flickered to life on the large screen, a young woman in a garden laughing as she turned toward the camera. "Stop filming, Tao," she called in accented English. "Come help me with these plants." Nina leaned forward, drinking in every detail. Lin Chenwei was beautiful, with the same high cheekbones and determined chin Nina saw in her own reflection. Her laughter was bright and unrestrained. The camera shook slightly as it was set down, capturing both Lin and a tall man, Tao, as he joined her among flowering bushes. They worked together, planting something, their movements in perfect harmony. Occasionally they spoke in rapid Mandarin that Nina couldn't understand. "What are they saying?" she asked softly. "They're discussing where to plant the jasmine," Mei translated. Lin wanted it near the house so the scent would come through the windows at night. Tao thought it should be along the path so visitors would smell it as they arrived. Jasmine, the scent that lingered at the edges of Nina's earliest memories. More videos followed, a family dinner much like the one they just shared. Lin holding a toddler Nina on her lap while singing a lullaby. Tao teaching little Nina to walk, his face alight with pride as she took wobbling steps toward the camera. "You kept all of these," Nina whispered, tears threatening. "Of course we did," Edward said. "You were never forgotten, Nina. Not for a single day." As the videos played on, Nina felt something shift inside her, not just grief for what she'd lost, but gratitude that these moments had been preserved, that this record of love existed. When the last video ended, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was David who broke it, rising from his seat to rummage through a cabinet. "I think we need something," he said, returning with a photo album. "This is yours now, Nina. We made a copy for ourselves." The album was bound in soft leather, with Chinese characters embossed on the cover. Inside were photographs organized chronologically. Nina's parents before she was born, their wedding, Nina as a newborn, first steps, birthday celebrations, ordinary moments made extraordinary by time and loss. "How did you find me?" Nina asked, looking up from a photo of herself blowing out candles on a cake shaped like a panda. "After all these years?" Edward exchanged glances with his son. "We never stopped looking," Peter explained. "Every few years we'd hire new investigators, follow new leads. We had age progression images created, checked orphanages and adoption records. But in the end," Edward added quietly, "you found us. By returning the ring, you completed the circle." Nina turned the pages slowly, absorbing this documented proof of her earliest years. On the final page was a newspaper clipping, a small article about foreigners caught in political violence. Lin and Tao's names were among those listed as missing. "We don't know exactly what happened," Mei said gently. "Just that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The authorities told us a small child matching your description had been found alone near the border, taken to an orphanage, then transferred out of the country for medical treatment. After that, the trail went cold." Nina closed the album, running her fingers over the cover. "I wish I could remember them clearly," she admitted. "I have impressions, a voice singing, the smell of jasmine being carried on someone's shoulders, but no real memories." "You were very young," Edward said, "but they would be so proud of the woman you've become. To pursue education despite all obstacles, to work so hard, to remain kind and honest. These are values they held dear." As the night grew late, Nina realized she had to leave. Early shift at the cafe tomorrow, then a critical exam. When she mentioned this, Edward looked surprised. "You're still planning to work at the cafe?" "Of course," Nina said firmly. "My life doesn't change overnight. Just because I found my family. I have responsibilities, commitments." Edward nodded slowly, respect in his eyes. "You're very much like your mother." When Lynn made up her mind about something, nothing could sway her. At the door, May pressed something into Nina's hand, a small key on a silk cord. "This opens Lynn and Tao's old apartment," she explained. "We've kept it all these years just as they left it. When you're ready, it's there for you." Nina looked at the key, overwhelmed by its significance. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come again," May requested. "Say this is just the beginning." Outside, a car waited to take Nina home, Edward's insistence, despite her protests. As she settled into the back seat, Nina saw the family, watching from the doorway, their figures silhouetted against the warm light from inside. Her family. The car wound through nighttime streets toward her apartment. Nina clutched the photo album and key, these tangible connections to her past. Tomorrow, she would wake up the same person, still a waitress, still a nursing student, still struggling to make ends meet. But now she knew she wasn't alone in the world. When the car stopped outside her building, Nina thanked the driver and climbed the familiar stairs to her apartment. Her roommates were home, their voices drifting from the kitchen. "How was your mystery dinner?" one called as Nina entered. She considered how to answer. What words could possibly capture the evening's significance? "It was," Nina began, then smiled as she found the right words. "It was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." Later, lying in bed surrounded by the quiet breathing of her roommates, Nina traced the jade pendant at her throat and whispered into the darkness, testing the words. "My name is Nina Wei Chen. I am the daughter of Lin and Tao. I am not alone." And for the first time in her memory, it was absolutely true. 6 months passed like water flowing downstream, steady but unstoppable. Spring turned to summer, summer to early autumn. Nina's life transformed not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small changes that added up to something profound. TUD. First change came 3 weeks after the family dinner. Nina was working her usual morning shift when Edward appeared at the cafe, not alone this time, but with May and a man in an expensive suit. "Nina," Edward called, waving her over. "Do you have a break coming up? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Luis raised an eyebrow at her from behind the counter. "Go ahead," he said. "I've got this covered." Nina untied her apron and joined them at a corner table. The stranger stood as she approached. "This is Mr. Huang," Edward introduced. "He manages our family's educational foundation." Mr. Huang shook Nina's hand with a respectful nod. "Mr. Chen has told me about your studies," he said. "We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to complete your nursing degree, and if you're interested in medical school afterward, that would be covered as well." Nina's mouth dropped open. That's incredibly generous, but..." "Before you refuse," May interrupted gently, "please understand this isn't charity. The foundation was established by Lin 30 years ago. Its purpose is to support promising students in healthcare fields. She would want this." Nina looked from face to face, seeing their sincerity. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Edward suggested with a smile. "Say you'll accept your mother's legacy, helping you achieve your dreams." And so Nina had said yes, not to leaving her job immediately. She insisted on giving proper notice. And not to moving into the family home. She valued her independence too much. But she accepted the scholarship, which meant no more late nights, working double shifts, no more choosing between textbooks and groceries. The second change came when Nina finally used the key May had given her. On a quiet Sunday, she stood outside the door of her parents' apartment, gathering courage before turning the lock. The space inside was like a time capsule. Elegant furniture draped in covers, bookshelves lined with medical journals and travel guides, photographs everywhere. Nina moved through the room slowly, touching objects her parents had touched, breathing air that somehow still seemed to hold traces of them. In what had been their bedroom, Nina found her mother's jewelry box. Inside, nestled among pearl earrings and jade bracelets, was a letter addressed simply, "For Nina, when you are older." With trembling hands, Nina unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, The ink faded, but still legible. "My darling daughter," it began. "As I write this, you are sleeping in the next room, not yet 3 years old. Tomorrow we leave for our trip. I'm tucking this away for when you're grown in case I ever need to remind you how very loved you are." Nina sank onto the edge of the bed, tears blurring her vision as she read her mother's hopes for her future, her pride in Nina's early independence, her dreams of the woman her daughter might become. "Wherever life takes you," the letter concluded, "know that you carry our love with you always. It is as much a part of you as your smile, your father's, and your determination. Mine, I'm afraid. Be brave, be kind, and remember that helping others is the surest path to joy. All my love, Mama." That letter became Nina's talisman, carried in her pocket on difficult days. Her mother's words bridged the gap between past and present, helping Nina understand where she came from and where she might go. The third change was perhaps the most unexpected. Nina was studying in the university library when someone dropped into the chair across from her. "Hey, cousin," David said with a grin. "Mind if I join you?" Since that first dinner, David had made it his mission to include Nina in his life, inviting her to family gatherings, introducing her to friends, bringing her coffee during finals week. Unlike the others who sometimes walked on eggshells around her, afraid of pushing too hard, David treated her as if she'd always been part of the family. "I'm meeting some friends for pizza later," he said now, pulling out his own books. "You should come." "I have clinicals early tomorrow," Nina started to decline. "It's just pizza, not an all-night party," David insisted. "Come on, you study too much." And so Nina found herself sitting in a crowded pizza place with David and his friends, mostly medical students like him, with a few engineers thrown in. They welcomed her easily, including her in inside jokes and asking about her nursing program. One of them, a quiet guy named Jack who was studying pediatric medicine, particularly caught her attention. When he learned about Nina's interest in pediatric nursing, they fell into a conversation so engrossing they barely noticed when the others started to leave. "We should continue this sometime," Jack suggested as they finally parted ways. "Maybe, over coffee?" That coffee date led to others, and slowly Nina found herself opening up about her unique story. Jack listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and shared parts of his own less dramatic but equally formative past. "It's amazing how you've handled all this," he told her one evening as they walked through a park. "Finding your family after all these years, balancing your old life with your new one. Some days I still feel caught between worlds," Nina admitted. "The cafe staff threw me a goodbye party last week and I cried the whole time. They've been my family for 3 years. Jack squeezed her hand. "Who says you can't have both, more? Family just means more people who care about you." By the time autumn leaves began to turn, Nina had settled into a new rhythm. Her scholarship allowed her to focus fully on her studies. She visited Edward and May for dinner every Sunday. She volunteered at a children's clinic where Jack was doing his rotation, and she'd begun the process of learning Mandarin with David as her enthusiastic, if occasionally impatient teacher. Then came the day that truly marked her transition from one life to another. Edward called her to his office, excitement evident in his voice over the phone. When Nina arrived, she found not just Edward, but Peter and the family lawyer. On the desk lay official-looking documents. "What's this about?" Nina asked. Edward gestured for her to sit. "We've finally sorted through the legal complications," he explained. "These papers officially recognize you as Lynn and Tao's daughter and rightful heir." Nina glanced at the documents without touching them. "I don't need money," she said quietly. "The scholarship is more than enough." Peter leaned forward. "This isn't just about money, Nina. It's about restoring what was taken from you, your identity, your heritage, your place in the family. Your parents left everything in trust for you," the lawyer added. "By law and by their explicit wishes, these assets belong to you." Nina thought of her mother's letter, the love it expressed, the hopes it contained. Would Lynn want her daughter to refuse this inheritance? What would this mean, practically speaking, she asked. Edward slid a folder across the desk. The trust contains investments, property, and a foundation dedicated to helping children displaced by political conflict. Lynn started it before you were born, expanded it after they decided to adopt a child, themselves. After they disappeared, we continued their work in their memory. Nina opened the folder, scanning figures that made her head spin. This is overwhelming. You don't need to decide anything today, Peter assured her. The trust has been managed well all these years. Take time to understand what it contains and what it means. After leaving the office, Nina didn't go back to her apartment, but instead walked to the park where she and Edward had opened the DNA results months ago. The cherry trees were losing their leaves now, preparing for winter's rest. Sitting on their bench, Nina thought about how much had changed since that day. She had gained a family, discovered her history, found direction for her future, yet something still felt unresolved. That evening she called Edward. "I've been thinking about the trust," she said, "especially the Foundation for Displaced Children." "It does important work," Edward replied. "Helps children find their families when possible, ensures good care when not." "I want to be involved," Nina said firmly. "Not just signing checks, but really involved. These children's stories are my story too." There was a pause before Edward answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would honor your parents' memory more." The next day, Nina visited the Foundation's offices. The staff welcomed her warmly, showing her programs that spanned 3 continents. As she looked at photographs of children being reunited with families or placed in loving homes, Nina felt a certainty settle over her. This was why she had survived when her parents hadn't. This was why she had found her way back to the Chens. After all these years. This was the bridge between her past and her future. That night, Nina sat at her desk in the small apartment she would soon leave for a place of her own. She opened her mother's letter once more, tracing the familiar words with her fingertip. Then she began to write, not to her mother who was gone, but to the children who might find themselves lost as she had been. Children who needed to know they weren't forgotten, that someone was searching for them, that belonging was still possible. "Wherever you are," she wrote, "know that you are not alone. Sometimes families are separated by circumstances beyond their control, but love leaves traces we can follow home." As she wrote, Nina felt the ruby ring on her finger, her mother's ring that Edward had insisted she keep. The circle that had brought her back to where she belonged. Not an ending to her story, but the beginning of something new and beautiful, born from loss but growing toward light.